These are the red flags that tell agents and editors they're reading an amateur draft, and they'll stop before page 10 if they see them. You'd be shocked how many sci-fi and fantasy drafts land on my desk with these same problems, often from really promising writers. Let's make sure yours doesn't get stuck there too. Here are 7 of the most common first draft mistakes I see that kill a novel's publishing potential, and I'll show you how to avoid them so you can actually finish a draft that works. Mistake number 1. Withholding too much for the sake of mystery. One of the most common problems I see in first drafts, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, is the impulse to create suspense by keeping the reader in the dark. You hint at something dramatic, drop cryptic dialogue, or open on a moment of ominous mystery, thinking it will spark curiosity. But instead of pulling the reader in, you're losing them completely. There's no setup of expectations, no anchor, no clarity about who they're following, what's happening, or why it matters. This mistake shows up throughout drafts, but it's an especially serious offender in the opening pages, when your reader hasn't committed yet. If they don't know who or what to care about quickly, they'll be too lost to want to stick around to figure it out. Readers don't get curious when they can't get past confusion. They get curious when they understand enough to start asking deeper questions, not just the basics of what's even going on. The brain craves patterns. Then some delightful surprises, some riffs on that pattern to keep it from feeling stale or boring. But the grounding in something familiar gives them something to work from. If you withhold too much, there's nothing for the reader's mind to hook into for further, more engaging thought. So instead of being mysterious, your story just feels vague, and that's a big reason drafts fall flat, even when your idea is strong. Writers I've worked with on this mistake tell me they're afraid of giving too much away. They want to save the information for a later reveal. But what this tells me is that they're actually afraid they can't pull off something more than basic, because their twist or shocking revelation is built on core information the reader needs to know, instead of seeding all the clues and need-to-know info with layered misdirection or emotionally meaningful framing that adds tension instead of hiding it. If your story only works when the reader is confused, it doesn't actually work. You're not writing in suspense, you're writing fog. And that's why the big reveal often falls flat. If you want to build suspense and give your reveals earned payoff, you need grounding first. Let the reader know who they're following, where they are, and what's emotionally at stake. They don't need to know everything, but they do need to know enough to care. Rule of thumb: if your point of view character knows something, your reader should too. Obviously, readers can't know everything your character knows instantly. But what it does mean is that your point of view character shouldn't just be cryptic for the sake of mystery. Readers experience the story through their lens. So if they're actively hiding information from the reader, it creates distance, and that isn't a good choice for the majority of stories. In some cases, your character might be emotionally blocked, repressing a memory, or unable to articulate what's wrong, and that can work, as long as the reader feels the tension of that internal struggle. But if the only reason you're withholding something is to save the twist, it's almost always a sign that the story's tension isn't working yet. However, the fix to giving too little away isn't giving everything or way too much, because that's the next mistake. Mistake number 2, overloading the reader with world building, lore, or backstory. This one is the opposite problem, giving too much, especially when it comes to world building, backstory, and lore. I know you've heard this advice before. Don't info dump. Most writers have. But here's the reality. Despite trying to actively avoid info dumping, you're probably still doing it, even if you don't think you are. Because when you're doing it, you genuinely think the information isn't a dump. It's necessary. This is especially true for sci-fi and fantasy writers. You've done all this deep work to create the inner workings of your world, your magic systems, the political conflicts, your character histories. You needed to know all of it to make your story feel real. So it makes perfect sense that it's hard to see how the reader can appreciate your story without that context to back it up, to fully understand what's going on, to feel the weight of it all. But here's the hard truth. Just because that information is necessary for you doesn't mean it is for your readers. At least not in that scene or in that way. Or maybe not in your draft yet at all. What I often see is writers trying to avoid info dumps by breaking the information into smaller pieces, mixing it into the narrative voice, or having characters deliver it through dialogue. But if that information still isn't anchored in the point of view character's immediate tension and what's happening emotionally in the present scene, it's still a dump. Just a dressed up one. And here's why that doesn't work. Even if you've dressed it up with subtlety, readers process story as if they're living their own emotional memories of it. Their brain is pulling on their own emotional memories through your point of view character's experience. So if the character has no reason to care about that detail in the moment, the reader won't either. Without emotional context, your brilliant world building is just noise. So to actually fix your info dumps, reveal your world through character experience. Let readers discover the rules of your magic system when your protagonist runs into a consequence of it. Let them feel the weight of backstory when it interrupts a current goal. Let your world be the character's obstacle, not the reader's lecture. Readers don't need a primer to understand and get invested. They need tension. And the fastest way to break immersion is to teach your world like it's a class instead of pulling the reader into it through someone they care about. Mistake number 3, writing in a try hard, too formal voice. A lot of first drafts I read from really thoughtful, talented writers suffer from a similar problem. The writing sounds like it's trying way too hard to be good. The vocabulary is elevated. The tone is stiff. Sentences are perfectly structured, but emotionally flat. It reads more like an academic paper or a literary essay than a novel. Most of the time, this comes from imposter syndrome. You don't want your writing to feel juvenile, so you default to what you think polished writing should sound like. Or because you're drawing on a historical style to match your equivalent time period, or a more aloof, mythical tone because you want your story to carry that expansiveness too. Something formal, impressive, sophisticated. But that means you're holding readers at a rigid distance. Brain science shows that immersion depends a lot on emotional proximity. Your reader is tracking the world and the story through your point of view character. If the language is too detached, too polished, or too above the character's actual emotional state, the brain won't register it as lived experience. It stays abstract, and the reader never drops into that story spell. This happens in both narrative and dialogue, and especially in speculative fiction where the reader's already trying to decode the world. Your voice is what helps them feel their way in. If the writing feels distant, the reader won't connect, even if your story is brilliant underneath. Here's the fix. Loosen your grip on perfect prose and write the way the character thinks. Let the narrative voice reflect their emotion, worldview, and natural rhythm. That doesn't mean lazy or sloppy. It means purposeful. Show us the world through the lens of someone living in it. Voice isn't about sounding a particular way, as counterintuitive as that seems. It's effective for making the reader feel and understand, and that won't happen if you're holding them at arm's length. Mistake number 4. Using too many point of view characters. I know the impulse, especially in sci-fi and fantasy. You've got a sprawling world, layered conflicts, and a cast of compelling characters, so you want to show all sides of it. The solution seems obvious. Give more of them a point of view. After all, it's basically an expectation of the genre at this point, right? But what usually happens is this. Instead of building a tighter narrative, the story branches out to an unwieldy degree. The threads get harder and harder to maintain and wrangle back together. The emotional core gets diluted and the pacing uneven. Your reader has a harder and harder time carrying. Multiple points of view can absolutely work, but only when they serve a focused, intentional purpose. In most early drafts, too many points of view show up not because the story needs them, but because the writer does. Sometimes the writer isn't fully sure who the story belongs to yet, but more often it's that they don't yet feel confident showing character depth without getting inside that character's head. It becomes a kind of over-explanation, a way to make sure readers don't miss what's important by just telling them directly through internal narration. But here's the truth. When you learn how to reveal motivation, tension, and subtext through interaction and viewpoint character perception, you can show emotional complexity without needing every character to be a narrator. And there's a reason this matters. Brain science tells us that we care about a story when we care about a character, right? And we do that through understanding a character, why they do what they do. So naturally, readers need some time in a character's POV. That doesn't mean single POV is always best, but Switching frequently or between too many character POVs, especially before that understanding is strong, breaks immersion along with the reason readers care. The brain has to reset, reorient, and rebuild the connection. And if it keeps happening, that understanding, that reason to care, never forms deeply enough to keep a reader reading through the end. Here's the fix. Before adding or keeping a POV character, ask yourself, what does this viewpoint give the reader that they can't get from the main lens? How does this perspective raise the emotional or thematic stakes? And is it really necessary, or is it covering for something you're afraid you can't show any other way? Because ultimately, readers don't need every perspective. They just need the one that makes them care, internally and emotionally carrying the main arc of the story. And that brings me to the next mistake. Mistake number 5. Prioritizing plot events over character transformation. In a lot of early drafts, especially from plot-focused writers, the story is packed with action. Things happen, big, exciting things. There are betrayals, deaths, battles, discoveries, and yet the story still feels flat. That's because the emotional journey isn't keeping pace with the external one. Brain science gives us a clue here. Readers stay engaged not just by what happens, but by how it changes the character. The brain is always looking for cause and effect, especially emotional cause and effect. If we can't see how each plot event impacts the protagonist's worldview, goals, or relationships, it feels disconnected, like a summary of things that happen, not a story we're experiencing. Writers often believe plot and character arc are separate, that you can map your twists and pacing beats and then figure out the character's emotional journey, maybe even like something tacked on at the end. But in reality, they're best developed together because they rely on one another. And when they don't, the plot starts to feel episodic. The scenes are technically escalating, but the character isn't changing in a core way that builds to the end. Or worse, they change suddenly near the end without enough buildup to make it feel earned. Here's the fix. Anchor your plot events to internal consequences. Better yet, make sure you're tailoring your plot events so that they specifically push internal change. Every scene should show us not just what happens, but why the character cares. What did this event shift in the character's belief system, emotional state, or sense of safety in the world? What choice did it force or reveal? Because transformation is what gives a story its shape and gives readers something to learn from, which is a key thing readers subconsciously seek in stories. Without it, you're not building toward a payoff. You're just stringing together events. Mistake number 6, skipping the premise and drafting without a clear story purpose. By the time most writers are frustrated with their draft, this is the mistake that's sitting at the center of it. They started writing without a clear story premise. And I get it, it's exciting to chase the energy of a new idea. You want to start writing before the spark fades, but without a clear premise. And hear that also as a clear promise, your draft quickly runs out of focus. Story decisions aren't being held to a solid goal. The conflict gets diluted and motivations appear blurry. Stakes suffer too, and your story becomes a collection of cool ideas with no real objective. Here's the brain-based reason that matters. Readers are constantly trying to orient themselves to what kind of story they're in. This is the expectations key, where readers want promises fulfilled. They're seeking certain things from the story at pretty regular intervals. And this doesn't just affect the reader, it affects you, because if you don't know what basic type of story you're writing, the main conflict, and whether it's all aiming to the same point together, you won't know where your draft is working or not. Here's the fix. Before you get too deep into your draft, or as soon as you realize you're floundering, pause and clarify your premise. 1 to 2 sentences max. What does your protagonist want? What's in the way, and why does it matter? Bonus points if within those sentences you can hint at what your character's internal tension is, what they need to learn. I have a quick set of 3 lessons to walk you through crafting your novel's guiding premise. You can grab this free mini novel premise course in the description box below. When you have that clarity, everything else gets easier. You'll know what belongs and what doesn't, and how to shape the story around a spine your readers can feel fulfilled in. Mistake number 7. Rejecting structure in the name of originality. This last one is a mindset issue, and it's one I see a lot, especially from writers who care deeply about their craft. They want to tell a story that feels original, unexpected, or bold, so they avoid traditional story structure on purpose. They resist turning points, they downplay arcs, and they actively resist anything that feels too formulaic. And I get it. You don't want to write something predictable. You don't want your story to feel like a template with new names slapped in. But that's not going to be an issue. Structure isn't what makes a story feel cliche. Empty execution does. And more importantly, structure isn't boxing you in. It's necessary for readability, pacing, escalation, emotional payoff. From a brain science perspective, structure works because it mirrors how we process and anticipate experiences. Readers are looking for that tension that escalates, turning points that shift perspective, and endings that resolve the internal struggle of the protagonist. When those elements aren't there, the story feels off to readers, even if they can't explain why. And when writers reject structure entirely, they often end up writing toward an ending that doesn't land because it was never emotionally set up in the first place. Here's the fix. Instead of seeing structure as a set of rules, treat it like scaffolding, a flexible frame that holds your story up while you build something ingenious on top of it. The originality isn't in whether you hit the turning points, it's in how you hit them and what they mean to your character and your reader. Structure doesn't limit your creativity. It gives it a shape strong enough to carry weight. They're called universal for a reason. Until you fix these two common mistakes, your draft isn't going anywhere. Not to agents, not to readers, and probably not even to the end. So if you recognized yourself in any of these, well, you're not alone. Most writers do. But that also means you're likely making one of the biggest mistakes right where it matters most, in your first few pages. And no, it's not just because of prologues. Let me clue you into the reasons almost every sci-fi and fantasy draft falls apart by chapter 3 in the video on your screen now.